The cold October wind of 41 tore the last leaves from the trees near Moscow, but from a height of 2,000 meters, this was not visible. The German reconnaissance pilot, glued to the optical sight, intently peered into the patchwork quilt of the city spread out below. His flight map clearly marked the landmarks: a bend in the river, wide avenues, the jagged walls of an ancient fortress, and the golden domes of cathedrals. These were ideal targets, whose coordinates every Luftwaffe squadron knew. The pilot checked his map, then looked down again, and cold bewilderment froze his movements. Where Red Square should have been, he saw only dense residential buildings, some gray roofs, and narrow streets. Where the map promised the golden gleam of domes, inconspicuous tops of ordinary buildings blackened. The huge city, like a living creature, changed its skin, dissolved into the twilight, deceiving not only the eye but also the very logic of navigation. The Kremlin disappeared. This was not magic or mass hypnosis. This was the greatest illusion in the history of wars, the first page in the grand chronicle of how one army learned to be invisible to defeat another, technically superior force. At that moment, the pilot did not yet know that he was looking at a masterpiece of architectural camouflage, created by the same people who built these buildings. He did not know that below, on the ground, millions of square meters of plywood, hundreds of tons of paint, and the genius of human ingenuity created a false reality to save the real one. The history of military art had long been built on the demonstration of strength. Bright uniforms, shining cuirasses, tall plumes, all served the purpose of intimidation and easy identification of one's own in the chaos of battle. Commanders of the past sought to be conspicuous so that their soldiers would see whom to follow. But the 20th century, which brought long-range artillery and aviation, turned this concept on its head. To be visible meant to be vulnerable. To be noticeable meant to cease to exist. Soviet military doctrine was one of the first to realize that in modern warfare, victory goes not to him who beats the drum loudest, but to him who can become a ghost. However, the path to this understanding was paved with bitter mistakes and hard lessons. Already in the early 30s, when the world was just feeling the tremor of the impending catastrophe, experiments began in Soviet laboratories that seemed like science fiction. Chemists, biologists, and artists united to solve a seemingly impossible task: how to hide a million-strong army in an open field. The answer lay not in the creation of invisible cloaks, but in understanding the psychology of perception. The human eye, like a camera lens, seeks familiar outlines, straight lines, correct geometric shapes, unnaturally even shadows. Nature does not create right angles. A tank standing at the edge of a forest gives itself away not by its color, but by its alien geometry. The task of camouflage was not to make an object transparent, but to break up its shape, to turn a formidable machine into a shapeless blotch that the observer's brain would filter out as visual noise. Thus was born the science that would be called camouflage in the West, and in the Soviet Union, it would become part of a broader and deeper concept: maskirovka. This word included not just painting equipment, but a complex of measures to mislead the enemy, create false targets, and conceal true intentions. When the Great Patriotic War began, theory clashed with harsh practice. In the first months, when the chaos of retreat mixed divisions and regiments, camouflage was spontaneous. Soldiers used branches, mud, haystacks, anything they could get their hands on to hide their positions from the all-seeing eye of enemy aviation. But very soon it became clear: makeshift methods were not enough. German optical reconnaissance worked with meticulous precision. Aerial photography made it possible to discern tank tracks on the grass, fresh earthworks of parapets, and even paths trodden to field kitchens. A systemic solution was needed, and it came in the form of creating a specialized maskirovka service, which worked in close conjunction with engineering troops. This was a war of intellects, where on one side of the scales lay German _"0" lenses, and the analytical departments of the Abwehr, and on the other, Soviet ingenuity, multiplied by the industrial scale of illusion production. On the external, tactical layer, this struggle looked like a competition of technologies and observational skills. Soviet industry began mass-producing camouflage nets, which became as important a resource as shells or fuel. But simply covering a tank with a net was not enough. Strips of fabric corresponding to the local color scheme had to be woven into the net. Faded grass for the southern steppes, dark conifers for the northern forests, dazzling white for winter campaigns. The famous disruptive patterns appeared, large, irregularly shaped spots that "won" the silhouette of the equipment, preventing the enemy gunner from aiming at vulnerable spots. A T-34 tank painted in three-color camouflage became practically indistinguishable at a distance of 500 meters in the undergrowth. However, the most interesting invention of the tactical level was false targets. Soviet engineers developed a whole line of mock-ups of military equipment. These were not just crude log constructions. Factories produced inflatable rubber tanks, wooden mock-ups of cannons, plywood airplanes, which looked absolutely real from a bird's-eye view. But creating a dummy is only half the battle. If a plywood tank stands motionless for several days, enemy intelligence will quickly realize the deception. Therefore, real spectacles were played out around these dummy armies. Special teams of soldiers simulated activity. They trampled paths to the dummies, lit fires, mimicking the work of field kitchens, and even moved the dummies at night to create the illusion of changing positions. There were even special devices that created thermal signatures and sound effects to deceive not only the eyes, but also acoustic reconnaissance equipment. This was a high-stakes game. Every shell spent by the enemy on a plywood dummy was a shell that did not fly at real soldiers. Every squadron of bombers sent to bomb a false airfield wasted fuel, time, and engine resources without inflicting real damage. However, behind these tactical ploys lay a deep internal human conflict. Imagine the state of people whose task was to build something that was meant to be destroyed. Architects, artists, and theater set designers called to the front, applied their talents not to create something eternal, but to create instantaneous deception. They built bridges that led nowhere, erected crossings that would not even hold a cart, but looked like powerful engineering structures. This required a special mindset and immense courage. They often had to work under fire, understanding that the success of their work was measured by how soon they would start being bombed. The psychological tension was colossal. Camouflage specialists were fighters of the invisible front, whose victory lay in remaining unnoticed or, conversely, becoming too noticeable in the wrong place. In the winter of '41, when German troops stood at the gates of Moscow, this internal conflict escalated into a nationwide feat. The camouflage of the Kremlin, which we mentioned at the beginning, was the pinnacle of this art. The group was led by academician of architecture Boris Iofan. He was tasked with hiding objects that were known worldwide. The Kremlin walls were repainted to resemble the facades of residential buildings, streets were drawn on the roofs, and the golden domes were painted over with dark enamel, which was later, after the war, removed with great difficulty. Plywood decorations of non-existent quarters grew in Manezhnaya Square and Alexander Garden. It was a surreal ghost city superimposed on the real capital. And it worked. Throughout the intense bombings, the Kremlin did not suffer critical damage, although it was target number one. The people who created this illusion understood. They were protecting not just stones, but a symbol of the country's resilience. If the Kremlin had been destroyed, the army's morale could have faltered. The ideological, philosophical layer of this confrontation lay even deeper. It was a clash of two worldviews: German Ordnung, order, system, belief in technical superiority and absolute accuracy of intelligence data, and Soviet Smekhalka, flexibility, unpredictability, the ability to act illogically. The German war machine worked like clockwork. If intelligence reported the concentration of tanks in Square A, then the strike would come from there. Soviet strategy, especially starting from 43, was built on breaking this mechanism by feeding it false data. Camouflage ceased to be merely a means of defense and became a tool of attack. This was the dialectic of war. Lies became the weapon of truth. To win, it was necessary to make the enemy believe in what was not there and not notice what was. The paradox was that to save the red stars on the sides of planes and tank armor, these stars had to be carefully painted over or hidden. Symbolism gave way to pragmatism. Ideology receded into the background in the face of the need for survival. This demonstrated the maturity of an army that learned not to die heroically, but to win professionally. The concept of a false object became the philosophical basis of many operations. To think like the enemy, to see the battlefield through his eyes, to predict his reaction to a particular stimulus. This required the highest intellect from staff officers. The general staff of the Red Army turned into a grand master playing a game where half the pieces on the board are invisible and the other half are imaginary. The turning point in this war of illusions came in the summer of 43 at the Kursk Bulge. The battle, known as the greatest tank battle in history, was largely won even before the first shot, thanks to an unprecedented camouflage operation. The Soviet command knew about the German offensive plan's citadel. The task was to create a deeply echeloned defense, the scale of which the enemy would not even suspect. Thousands of kilometers of trenches were dug, hundreds of false artillery positions were built. In one section of the front, the concentration of an entire tank army was simulated. Radio stations worked, broadcasting false orders. Tank mock-ups moved at night, creating noise and dust. The Germans pulled significant air force and artillery forces there, methodically plowing empty fields. At the same time, the true reserves of the steppe front were concealed with such thoroughness that German aerial reconnaissance simply lost an entire army. Tanks stood in revetments, covered by camouflage nets that blended with the terrain. Any movement during the day was forbidden under penalty of court-martial. Hundreds of thousands of people lived underground, betraying their presence neither by the smoke of a field kitchen nor the glint of metal. When the battle began, the Germans discovered with horror that their maps were outdated. Where there should have been emptiness, they were met with a barrage of anti-tank artillery fire. Where they expected weak defenses, impregnable bastions stood. The element of surprise, usually belonging to the attacker, here turned out to be on the side of the defenders. This was a transformation of the very essence of war. An invisible force stopped a visible power. The Battle of Kursk proved that camouflage is not just a way to hide. It is a way to control the enemy's actions, to impose one's will on him, to make him commit fatal mistakes. The culmination of the art of disinformation and stealth was Operation Bagration in the summer of '44. It was a masterpiece of strategic camouflage. The goal was the liberation of Belarus. The German command was absolutely convinced that the main blow of the Soviet troops would follow in the south, in Ukraine. All logical arguments pointed to this. The terrain there was more convenient for tanks, and successful battles were already underway there. To strengthen this conviction in the enemy, Soviet troops launched a grand imitation of preparing an offensive precisely on the southern flank. Echelons with mock tanks demonstratively moved there. The airwaves were active, creating the appearance of a concentration of strike groups. Meanwhile, in the Belarusian forests and swamps, under conditions of complete radio silence, an enormous force was gathering. The transfer of troops was carried out only at night. During the day, the roads were empty. Tank columns moved with their headlights off. Traffic controllers used special luminous signs visible only from the ground. Any sound was muffled. Tanks moved on corduroy roads. Log platforms laid across swamps previously considered impassable. Engineers built bridges underwater, half a meter below the river level, so that they would not be visible from the air. The water concealed the crossings, and to German pilots, the river seemed an insurmountable obstacle, while in reality, it had already been occupied by Soviet troops. The scale of the secrecy was such that even many regimental commanders, until the very last moment, did not know the overall plan of the operation, receiving orders only within the scope of their narrow task. When, on June 23, '44, the earth trembled from thousands of guns, it came as a complete surprise to Army Group Center. The blow was struck where it was least expected, through swamps and forests, which German generals considered reliable protection without any troops. An invisible army suddenly materialized out of nowhere. The effect was devastating. The front crumbled in a matter of days. German divisions were encircled before they could even understand where the threat had come from. It was a triumph of the Soviet school of camouflage, a moment of truth when the ability to conceal became more important than the ability to shoot. The entire might of the Wehrmacht in Belarus was ground down because they were fighting phantoms in the south, missing the real blow in the center. The significance of this experience extends far beyond the history of World War II. The lessons learned then resonate in the modern world, even though technology has changed beyond recognition. Today, in the age of satellites, thermal imagers, and drones, the principles of an army without red stars remain as relevant as ever. The tools have changed. Instead of plywood and paint, radio-absorbing materials, false thermal targets, and electronic warfare systems are used to create digital mirages on enemy radars. But the essence remains the same. War is the way of deception. Victory goes to those who possess information and know how to distort the enemy's information field. We see how the concept of camouflage has evolved from a tactical maneuver to an element of state strategy and information security. The ability to protect one's secrets, to conceal one's true capabilities and intentions, is the currency of sovereignty in the 21st century. Those distant events teach us that reality is not always what it seems at first glance, that behind apparent weakness can lie colossal strength, and behind a formidable display of power, emptiness. The history of Soviet camouflage is a lesson in critical thinking. It teaches us not to blindly trust the picture, to analyze the context, to look for what is hidden in the shadows. It is a reminder that the human factor, creativity, and an unconventional approach can surpass any technical advantage. When we look back at those battlefields, where forests now grow and new cities stand, we understand that victory was forged not only with steel and fire, but also with the artist's brush, the engineer's calculation, and the silence of the radio waves. That German pilot, searching for the Kremlin in October 41, never found his target. He dropped bombs into emptiness, onto false objects, flying away with the certainty that he had completed his mission. And below, beneath a layer of camouflage paint, the heart of a vast country continued to beat, coordinating defense and preparing for future victories. Moscow endured because it managed to become something else. This historical paradox, to disappear in order to remain, to hide in order to win, is a powerful metaphor for any struggle for existence. An army without red stars, a ghost army, an enigma army, proved that intelligence is the most formidable weapon. Returning to the image of painted domes and plywood roofs over the mausoleum, we see in this not fear, but the highest form of wisdom. To protect what is valuable by any means, even if it means concealing one's true face. True greatness does not need constant demonstration. It manifests itself in the result. And this result is preserved lives and the end of the most terrible war in human history in the aggressor's capital, which, unlike Moscow, could not hide from retribution.